What's up? My name is Guy. I'm a full-time filmmaker obsessed with self-development. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, this is where I discover tips, tricks, and tools that help me on my journey of self-development, both as an artist as well as in business. And I'm stoked to be sharing these things pretty much in real time with you. In today's video, it's all about how to study effectively. Now, I myself am not a student anymore, but both of my siblings are. And recently my brother asked me, Guy, how do you study effectively? How did you study successfully back in college? And so I passed on some tools and some methods that I remembered worked pretty well for me when I was an undergraduate. But after the call, I just kind of felt unsatisfied with my answers. I felt like I wasn't able to pass on a deliberate, sort of systematic approach that I'd be certain would work across a range of different contexts. And so I looked into it more. And since we're in the middle of this series on Rome, I started thinking about how Rome could help in this process. What would I have done if I'd had a tool like Rome available to me as a student? And so by researching it more, I quickly came across Ali Abdaal's videos on how he studied, back when he was in Cambridge and how he ranked really, really highly in Cambridge. And so what I'm sharing with you today is very heavily inspired by the series of videos that Ali Abdaal made on this very topic. I'm linking to them below. Ali's a fantastic YouTuber. I highly recommend you check him out. And there is one video in particular where he breaks down, using a range of scientific studies, how most of the commonly used methods that we all apply when we study are actually really inefficient. And it made me look back at my own time as an undergraduate, and I'm realizing, wow, I did pretty well, but I think I did pretty well in spite of my study techniques, not because of my study techniques. Whatever successes I had now seem to be mostly accidental. So I'm super stoked to be sharing these things with you. So when I say studies, I mean meta studies. These weren't like one or two experiments that yielded some incredible results and then were never replicated. These are, results that were extrapolated over hundreds and hundreds of different studies. And if you want the details, the scientific details on what those studies say, reference all these videos below. But here's the gist. The three most common techniques that people cite that they use for studying are rereading, highlighting, and summarizing your notes with new notes. And so what the results show is that on average, all three of those don't raise your grades significantly. I say on average because every person is different and there's going to be a range of different results that you're seeing among individuals. But if we're trying to extrapolate some, general systems from this, the average is kind of important. Instead, what works really well is a technique called active recall. Active recall is basically testing yourself on the material that you've learned. So you have to retrieve the material in different contexts in which it might pop up, aka different test questions. And the funny thing is that if you give students the four different options, rereading, highlighting, summarizing, and active recall, and you ask them which one of these do you guess will yield the best results, on average, people rank active recall the lowest. So there's a huge disconnect between what we believe is effective and what is actually effective when you look at the results. And so I wanted to look into active recall more, and the underlying principle that makes this technique work, and I'm sure you've heard of this before, is the phrase neurons that fire together wire together. And this is something that neurobiologists discovered, and it's quite literally true that when you activate two different neurons at the same time, there will be a synaptic link between them that forms over time. So neurons that fire together wire together. What does that mean? Basically, this is just association. So when you do active recall and you retrieve information from your brain, linking it to a specific context or to another piece of information. So when you associate those two together, then it'll strengthen the information storage in your brain, but it'll also strengthen the associative link. So when you recall one, you'll recall the other, and vice versa. And this is really important in test questions because when you're in an exam, speed is paramount, right? Because it's not just about whether you can find the information in your brain somewhere, it's also about how quickly you can retrieve it. So being able to quickly associate specific questions or specific themes on an exam with the right answer to a particular question is going to give you a huge edge. Basically, association is really important. Even if you have the piece of information that you're looking for somewhere, you need to be able to associate it correctly. Otherwise, you might not find it, or you might not find it fast enough. And so I realized Rome research is all about association, right? I mentioned this in past videos. It's not just about whether you can find a specific piece of information in Rome. It's really about how it associates to other things that you're searching for, or how it associates to even next level things that you didn't know you were searching for, but now they're coming up because you were diving deeper into one particular topic. So this associative effect, this network effect in Rome is really what makes it so powerful. And like I said before, it tries to imitate how our brains work. And so let's use this to our advantage when we're trying to study more effectively, saving ourselves time and increasing those grades. So here's takeaway number 1. When you're creating your study material, so that's from textbooks or from lectures, when you're taking notes, try to associate your notes, right? And that can be across lectures, that can be across books, that can be across different theme blocks that you're setting up. It can even be across different media or different sources that you've used outside of what is given to you within your class. One concrete example would be tagging notes by themes. This is especially relevant if you're taking classes that are very volume intensive. So anything in sort of psychology, anatomy, anything to do with medicine is going to be really, really material intensive. And so breaking things down into thematic blocks that you can associate to very specific types of questions is going to be valuable. So tag those things accordingly, come up with a system that works for you, but tag them right as you're taking your notes. So that saves you a lot of time. And automatically you're starting to associate, things from past lectures, different books, different movies that you've watched, different conferences that you've attended in the past. You're gonna start to associate them automatically as you're taking notes. But of course, if you're not doing it in the first step, then Rome will do it on the back end quite automatically, and this is going to be important in later steps. That takes us to takeaway number 2. Write down questions based on the notes that you took. So this is really the core of the active recall method, is to write down questions for yourselves, and then you're studying by just answering those questions. And you basically just go through question by question. You don't even have to write down the answer. Either you know it or you don't know it. And if you don't know it, mark them accordingly, right? Use a hashtag dedicated to questions that you couldn't answer right away. And then those are going to collect and accumulate in a separate page, which you can visit later on. The more direct way to do this, which saves you even more time, is actually not to take any notes at all. Instead, when you're reading the textbooks and when you're in lectures, you're going to train yourself to immediately write down questions for yourself based on what you're hearing or what you're learning in the book. And that just skips a step, right? It allows you to not have to take those notes as a sort of an intermediary function, instead going directly to the questions. And afterwards, the process is the same. You just go through and you test yourself with these questions that you've strategically come up with. And the better you know your prof, the better you know the class. And maybe you've talked to older students that have taken, the class in the past. So you already know what kind of questions, a prof is likely to put on the exam, or what kind of questions your TA is likely to ask you in an exam. Because usually, TAs and profs will sort of contribute equal amounts of questions to your particular final exam or a midterm or whatever you might be looking at, even a quiz, right? The better you can anticipate the types of questions that are going to come up on the exam, the better your marks are going to be. So what's going to happen is you're skipping that sort of unnecessary step of writing notes. You're just writing the questions down directly and you're testing yourself on the things that really matter. Now, why do I say unnecessary? Because the studies that I've been talking about show that note-taking, like I said before, isn't very effective. It kind of falls into this category of summarizing, summarizing your notes again into more concise forms. And surprisingly to me, it didn't yield the kind of results that people were expecting, especially students were expecting. Remember that active recall is consistently rated as being the least effective, when you ask students what they think is going to be true, whereas in fact, it's the most effective method of studying. And one of the likely reasons that note-taking isn't all too effective when you average it out over a large amount of people is that everybody has different note-taking techniques. And some are very effective and some are very ineffective. And so you're better off actually skipping that sort of risky step of taking notes that might not do all too much, and instead just save yourself the time, go right to the questions, go to the things that matter, and then that frees up more time to do the things that you really want to do. And then the only time that you reference your textbook, or if it's not in there, your lecture recordings, is when you don't know the answer to a question. So you'll be going through, you'll be answering them, and then you'll mark the ones that you don't know, they'll go into a separate page, and that's when you go into your materials, your scratch materials, not your notes, your textbook or your lecture recording, and you'll find the right answer. And that's the point where I think it's beneficial to actually write out the answer in your separate, hard questions page. You're going to be writing them out, and you're going to be pulling in the relevant materials, be that from your textbook, or even a Google search will sometimes give you a lot of information that you can pull in. And it's going to be there for reference because you already know that these questions might be, problem points for you down the line. So you'll have them all in one place, very easy to reference. And so you can review those, let's say, twice as often as you review your other questions. And so when you get to the point in your active recall process where you can't answer a question and you have to look it up in the source materials, it's going to be really important, for the sake of efficiency and saving time, that you can access the right material very, very quickly. And that takes us to takeaway number 3. How do you create effective workflows that allow you to quickly reference the right materials for your problem question without wasting time? And that's a bit of a tricky one because it really depends on the format of your source materials. So it could be as simple as just having your textbook open next to you. And if you know the textbook relatively well, if you have a rough idea of where the right sections are, you could find them relatively quickly. But if you've ever taken an open book exam, finding the right information in a thick textbook like this is easier said than done. So preferably, you'll have something like a PDF of the textbook, and you'll have it open in your browser, and you'll be able to use search functions to get to the right materials just using keywords. So those are definitely 2 very popular ones. The thing that would take this to the next level is for you to import all of your source files into Roam and having them in one central place. You're going to have your page with the problem questions, with those questions that you couldn't answer right away. And when you input the right answers to those questions, instead of having to go into your textbook and type out the answers, or even using a search function in your PDF and then copy pasting things in, ideally you would just be able to use the block reference or the block embed function in Roam to pull in the right materials from your different sources. That's especially useful if you have more than one book or more than one paper that you're referencing in class. So typically, the higher up, the more difficult your classes get as you're moving, into your later years of college. Instead of textbooks, you're often going to have a large amount of papers assigned. So that's when it becomes really useful. If you have a way to easily just import those papers into your Roam, then you can use the block reference or the block embed function to pull from a bunch of different papers. You can do a search for it in your sidebar, and you can simultaneously pull from a range of different sources for that relevant question. It's going to save you a lot of time. Now, importing stuff into Roam is a bit of a double-edged sword. It really depends on what format your original source is in and how it's going to pull it in to Roam. I'm just saying this because I want you to be careful that before you spend hours and hours trying to finagle the right way to import all of your source materials into Roam, only to find that the format has been completely screwed up and it's of no use to you whatsoever. Just see if you can, quickly test away to see if the formatting, stays the same when you pull it into Roam. And if it doesn't, I would say just go with like a simpler solution. Basically, what you want to avoid is having, a nicely formatted source material and then pulling that into Roam. And instead of it respecting the paragraphs and putting it into separate blocks, it might just clump all of your text into one massive block. Like picture your entire textbook, or even just, a 30-page paper being all in one giant block, and it effectively makes it useless because now when you're in your block embed function and you're searching for a key term in that block, your block embed is just gonna pull in the entire textbook, and it's not going to be very useful to you. And if it doesn't work, until Roam comes up with a very effective search in picture function, I'd say you're better off just using a simpler method and copy pasting things in as needed. One bonus tip, something that I always liked in college, is when professors assigned real books, as in like books that are not textbooks. And the reason why I like that is because I would try to go onto Audible and I would try to find a audio version of the book. And that's because when it comes to reading, I love reading, but I'm not particularly fast. So when you're prepping for lectures, like I said, instead of taking detailed notes and reading the textbook very carefully, you're oftentimes better off just skimming through things very quickly. And I personally love having, things on Audible that I can run at triple speed, just like an hour before lecture. And I'm not going to retain everything, but I'm going to have a rough idea of what's going to be talked about, and it's going to be a lot easier for me to come up with questions, in this hypothetical example, because I did not do this as a student, this whole active recall thing. I wish I had, but now if I were to apply this active recall method, it would be a lot easier, I think, to come up with those questions that you're going to recall for yourself live in class if you have a rough idea of what's going to be talked about. And anytime that you have something in audio format, one simple way to pull it into Roam in an automated way is just to run it through Otter.ai or a similar transcription software. But I personally like Otter, and usually Otter splits things up quite decently when it comes to paragraphs. So when you're pulling over your text file from Otter into Roam, the formatting is going to be quite good. If anything, Otter splits up paragraphs a little bit too often. And in terms of what you need in Roam, this is actually quite ideal, because it's just going to make those snippets of information that you pull into your problem questions page that much shorter. So it's going to be that much easier and concise to review. So in summary, traditional study methods don't work particularly well. Active recall works extremely well. So how to do active recall? You write down questions that you think are going to come up in the exam. One way to do this is to take notes on your textbook, on your lectures, and then write down questions based off that. Or you skip that intermediary step and you write down questions directly as you're in lecture listening to your prof. And then you just go through the questions, you answer them in your mind, you don't write them down. And the only time you tag a question is when you don't immediately have the answer, and it's going to go into a separate page in your Roam dedicated to those questions. And then you're going to look up the answers to each of those questions by referencing the source material. And you're going to write little answer blocks, and this is where it's going to be really useful to use block embeds and block references to pull in selectively the different, bits and pieces of material and information that you need to answer that question. It's going to be there for you to reference when you're going through your second or third or fourth round of revising those questions. And that's it. Next week, I'm going to look at applying the same approach to essay-based questions specifically. So those are the kind of tests that don't just require short answers or multiple choice, they require longer structured essays. And so what we talked about in this video is kind of applicable across the board. And then next week, I want to go a lot more in depth and see how those same principles might apply to an essay-based approach. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment. Let me know what you think of these techniques, if they work for you, if you've applied other things in the past and have done so effectively. Let me know if you have things that could supplement this kind of active recall method, especially if you've tried using tools like Roam to help you on that journey. Please let me know. I'm always looking for more inspiration and for more effective ways to process information in these kinds of ways. So I just really appreciate you being here. Thanks for your time. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you next week.